Hello, everybody. Welcome to Geezerology. This week, we're going to talk about the Bob Dylan album from 1965, Highway 61 Revisited. I asked Bob last week what he wanted to talk about in this video, and this is the album he picked. I had never heard it before. I'd heard a couple tunes on it, obviously, but I'd never listened to the album before. I thought, this is a good opportunity for me to go in and listen to that album that I've been saying for 20 years that I'm going to listen to. I never got around to it. So I did that. I listened to it 4 times over the last 3 or 4 days, including the 4th time this morning. So I got to know it pretty well in that time. But before I tell you what I think about it, I'm going to turn it over to Bob, since this is his suggestion, so he can steer the conversation. Bob, tell me about Highway 61 Revisited.
I would love to, Scott. Thank you. Okay, just for the uninitiated, this is the album. This thing has been in my collection for decades. I haven't listened to it in a long, long time. And when I came up with the idea of talking about this, I did so because of the impact this album had on the American music, on the rock scene in particular. So before I get into my impression of this album, I feel we need to do a little history. And of course, everybody knows who Bob Dylan is, but I wanted to cover a little bit of his early history to set the stage for how this album came about and what it did. So Dylan has had a 6-decade music career, incredible impact on American culture, on American music. He's received a Nobel Prize for literature. And Dylan, through those 6 decades, has moved in and out of a lot of musical genres. He started out as a folkie. He became a rock performer. He became a born-again Christian and did 3 gospel albums. Toward the latter part of his career, he delved into the American songbook and started covering classic American songs. So if you want to talk about Bob Dylan, there are a lot of entry points into his career that you could dissect. So this album is his 6th album. It came at the end of his period as a folk singer. Dylan is a native of Minnesota. He grew up in Minnesota's Iron Range, which is a big mining area. Goes to St. Paul, Minnesota, becomes a college student, and while there, is enamored with Woody Guthrie, the classic American folk singer. Bob drops out of college, takes his acoustic guitar and harmonica, goes to New York City, hangs out in the Greenwich Village folk scene. At this time, Woody Guthrie is in a hospital suffering from the latter stages of Huntington's chorea and is basically dying. Dylan gets a chance to meet him, hangs out with him. Guthrie mentors him, and Dylan takes on a Woody Guthrie persona. His first album is an entire acoustic folk album, only has 2 original songs. One of them is a song for Woody. So, he memorialized his folk idol. His subsequent albums were all acoustic. He hooked up with Joan Baez at one point, not only professionally, but intimately, becomes very political, writes these classic protest songs, Blowing in the Wind, The Times Are A-Changing, Masters of War. He becomes very, very famous over his folk music. Then Dylan starts to want to move into a different direction. He starts looking at electric music and doing some rock stuff. And as I said earlier, Highway 61 Revisited is his 6th album. It's a total electric album, except for one song, but even that song has backing from a band, so it's not a pure solo acoustic thing. This was not Dylan's first voyage into electric music. On the preceding album, Bringing It All Back Home, half of that album was electric, half of it was acoustic. So Dylan is working on this album, and before this album was released, he had his infamous appearance at the Newport Folk Festival in '65. He did 2 shows there. The first one was an all-acoustic folk set. He comes back the night of the night of the end of the festival to close it out, and he comes up and goes electric, does Maggie's Farm and a couple other songs. And supposedly, according to legend, he's booed off the stage. Everybody's angry that he's turned this thing into electric. There's one anecdote about somebody had an axe trying to run around to cut the power cables and stuff. So then he releases Highway 61 Revisited. Excuse me. It is a complete and total departure from Dylan's previous material. It is, as I said, very heavy electric. It's rock, it's blues. The writing is completely different than what he's done before. Previously, he was doing pretty much straight ahead music with lyrics that were easy to understand. They painted a very open picture of what he was trying to say. With Highway 61 Revisited, he got very introspective. He had hooked up with beat poet Allen Ginsberg. A lot of the music on here, the lyrics and stuff, it's very much a stream of consciousness type thing. And Highway 61 Revisited is hailed by almost everybody as one of the most important albums that's ever come out. It heralded a sea change in American music. It comes out at a time when the British invasion is at full swing. The Beatles have conquered the US. We're getting all of these English bands. Prior to Dylan doing this album, folk was probably the predominant musical genre in the US. And Dylan, walked away from that and went electric and plugged in. So everybody hails this as an incredible album. So historically, that's kind of where we are with this album. Now, my opinion of the album, I don't like it. I bought the album decades ago, listened to it, couldn't really get into it, other than one of its more famous songs, Like a Rolling Stone. Everybody knows that song is one of Dylan's most popular. That song I like. The rest of the album, musically, I like it. It's got a kind of a jangly sound to it. It's got some blues influence in it. Although Dylan and his musicians worked quite a bit on some of the songs, did several takes, it doesn't feel like music that was forced. It feels organic. It feels kind of raw. It's kind of jangly. And so musically, I like it. My problem with it is I have no idea what in the hell he's trying to say with most of this. And over the last few days, I have read about this album. I've read review after review. I've listened to it multiple times. I even sat down with my iPad, playing the songs with the lyrics scrolling across the screen, trying to decipher what Dylan was trying to say with this. And there are some places here and there where I think I have an understanding of what he was trying to say, but I guess I'm a troglodyte. I just don't get it. And I finally got to a point where I said, I don't care to invest enough time to try to figure out what you're saying, if you're even saying anything at all. I have a suspicion in the back of my mind that this was just word association with Dylan, and that he was just throwing stuff out there without some of it even having any meaning. And again, I may be a troglodyte that I don't get it when everybody else seems to get it. So that's where I'm at. That's my sacrilege. That's my feeling on this album. Scott, take it away, my friend.
Well, let me ask you a question first. What prompted you to suggest that we have this discussion about this album?
Okay, what prompted me to decide to do the discussion is one, that I had never really delved into the album that deeply, and that I have kind of a love-hate thing with Dylan. There are some masterpieces that he's written. There's also some stuff that really stinks. Okay, so he's been up and down in his career. And I know about the importance that has been given to Dylan and the importance of legitimatizing rock music in this country, leading us away from the folk scene into rock. and inspiring that movement. I like folk music, but I think a lot of the people doing folk music at that time were posers. You had these clean-cut college kids who picked up a guitar and a banjo and went out and started singing songs that were done by slaves and field hands and working people and stuff, and they're trying to pass themselves off as being the spokespeople for that. So I think there was a lot of posing going on in that folk scene. But Dylan has been called the spokesman of our generation. So I felt that since we're taking a look at this music and that Dylan holds this high plateau or is held in such esteem, that it would behoove me to take a look at that to see what's there. And so, being quite candid, the way that I usually do Dylan is to do like a greatest hits type thing or listen to a live recording or something. I have a hard time taking a lot of Dylan in a single sitting, especially when, like on this particular album, I like a Rolling Stone. Rest of the album, I really have a hard time listening to. So that's the way I kind of take Dylan. So I felt this was going to be a learning experience for me to really see what this album meant for that transition from folk to rock in this country. So that makes sense?
Yeah. I'm not, my first thought when I was thinking through this is that, this is an album that's 55 years old, 56 years old. So it seemed kind of silly to me, in a sense, listening to this for the first time and then trying to deliver a critique of it, because this is like the stone tablet that came out 55 years ago. It's like what does it matter what I think about it? There's a lot of water that's gone under the bridge since this album came out. I knew like a Rolling Stone and a couple of the early Dylan songs. I've never been a huge Dylan fan ever. I've picked up on a few of his albums later in his career that I thought were pretty good and I enjoyed for a time, but probably 3 or 4 albums. Slow Train Coming was actually the first Dylan album that I actually ever listened to straight through, and I liked it a lot. It took a lot of criticism when it came out, but I liked it. It actually made me kind of a fan of Dylan. And then a couple of his mid '80s albums, Empire Burlesque, and I can't think of another one that came out right after, Infidels and Empire Burlesque, and then a little later the Daniel Lanois produced Oh Mercy, which came out I think in the late '80s or early '90s. And I liked all those albums. And so I kind of dabbled in Dylan a little bit here and there, beyond that. And like I say, it's like most of the stuff I thought was pretty good, but never was a huge fan. So I went back and I listened to Highway 61 Revisited. And my first reaction was, I'm with you, but I'm not a lyric. I've never been a lyric guy. I never pay that close attention to lyrics. I just kind of hear the lyrics as something that's there. I'm more getting into the musicality of the thing and kind of the emotion is coming through. I can kind of pick up on a little bit just picking up a liner here of the lyrics. I've never gone in and studied lyrics and tried to figure out what the allegories are or the symbolism or anything like that. My impression listening to this album is that why is Dylan so pissed off at everybody? What? I mean, was there in 1965? I don't know how old was Bob. How old was he then? Is it his 20s? yeah, his early or mid-20s. It's like, you know, he's like 24 years old. Is there anybody that he's not pissed off at? I mean, that's what that's what that's what kept coming through to me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, ease up, fella. Goodness gracious. I get it. It's, you know, it's you know, it was, you know, it was Bob just saying these things that people are people are always thinking about, and calling people out and calling down the establishment, and you know, things like that, which was I think was a big thing back then. Uh, the music on it was okay. You know, it just first impression of the music is that Like a Rolling Stone. If you hear Like a Rolling Stone, you've heard this album. They're, you know, I mean, the more I listened to it, the more I heard the differences in the songs. I could start identifying what was going on in each of the individual songs. But overall, it just sounds like Bob Dylan just standing on a street corner and yelling out his grievances over this kind of background musical accompaniment. That's what my impression of the album is. Do I dislike the album? No, I don't dislike the album. I don't particularly like it. It's just not. It's not my wheelhouse at all. You know, I know that some of the musicians on the album went on to have pretty good careers and are well thought of. But this is back in an era when I wasn't listening to that kind of music at all. I mean, you know, Al Cooper is the organist here. You hear Al Cooper's Hammond organ a lot through this thing. I think Mike Bloomfield is playing lead guitar, and he gets in a couple of pretty good blues licks on the guitar. But mostly it just sounds to me like Dylan ranting and raving while these guys are in the background playing music. And you know, and the music on the album doesn't really necessarily go along with what Dylan's doing. It's like two different things going on there. It's just Dylan standing there screaming into the wind. So, Like a Rolling Stone, it's, you know, after 56 years, that song does kind of grow on you. I mean, actually, you know, there's another version of Like a Rolling Stone that I'd much rather listen to. That's Hendrix's cover of it. I'll listen to that anytime. Dylan's is like, yeah, every now and then it's good. I thought overall, though, I thought most of the songs on this album were pretty good for what they were. And, you know, and also keeping in mind that I'm coming at this over a half a century late. So, like I said, a lot of things have happened since then. So I don't understand the context that this album came out in 1965. You know, I was a 9-year-old fifth grader in 1965 when this came out. So obviously I had no idea what this was back then. The one song on the album I hate is that title song with that whistle that goes through there. It's like, God, it makes me want to grab the vinyl. If I was listening to vinyl, I'd want to grab the vinyl and break the vinyl over a table. God, I couldn't stand that. It's driving me crazy. And then the last song on the album, what's the title of that last song? 11. It's like 11 minutes. What is it? What's the title?
Desolation Row.
Desolation Row.
Yeah.
It's an 11-minute song, and about the 3-minute mark, I was ready for him to wrap it up. You know, it's just pretty monotonous, and not a whole lot different than a lot of other things that are going on in this album. I don't know. It's like, again, I don't understand what was happening in the world. I don't remember what was happening in the world at that time. In 1965, I was listening to the Beatles and Winchester Cathedral and the Monster Mash and things like that. I had no idea this stuff existed. I knew Peter, Paul, and Mary. I knew the Kingston Trio because they would pop up on your TV set every now and then. So I knew what the folk music was, but I didn't understand it. And Bob Dylan wasn't turning up on our TV sets back in that time. So I didn't know. But anyway, at the time I didn't know what was happening with it. Maybe if I was old enough and to understand it and heard this in 1965 when it came out, I probably would have been blown away with this album then. But looking back on it 56 years later and everything that's happened since then and how the world has changed and how my taste in music has evolved. Yeah. And a lot of people have this on their greatest of all time albums list. It's not on mine.
Yeah.
It's not on mine. I'll be happy. I'll be happy to talk in the future and videos about some other Dylan albums where he becomes more he wasn't musical on this album. He's just, like I say, he's just there ranting and raving over Al Cooper's Hammond organ and a couple of guitars and drums. Yeah. And Dylan later became what I could call his music, more musical. Stuff he did with a band in the later side in the '70s. I never listened to that stuff that much, but I'm familiar with it, and it just seemed to me that he did become more musical. I mean, his voice never improved, but he figured out a way, and maybe he got some producers and some people or whatever, but he figured out a way to make his voice an integral part of the music that he started doing a few years later and going forward, even to this day. I heard an album, one of his more recent albums, come out a couple years ago, and his stuff is good. It's good music. Highway 61 Revisited to me is not good music. It's just kind of there in the zeitgeist, and that's about how I can relate to it. Is that it's a piece of history, not a piece of history that I necessarily understand, but what a lot of people, a lot of experts and a lot of pros say it was a vital piece of music at the time. Yeah, I'll just go. I won't argue with that. I just don't get it.
I have to say, Scott, I'm really surprised. I was expecting you to get into this more than I would have, because you're.
I was surprised when you started out telling me that you didn't like this, because I thought you suggested you want to talk about this because I thought maybe this was one of your favorites from the past.
No, I wanted to understand why it's considered so important, because I had never really paid any attention to it. And I tried way back a long time ago, couldn't get into it. And everywhere I go, I hear, Rolling Stone magazine lists like a Rolling Stone as one of the most important songs ever. This album made it to number 3 on the charts. So it sold like crazy.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a huge success. And like I said, when I started doing research in this, everywhere I turned, there is nothing but praise heaped for this album. And I really wanted to know why. So I thought, since we're doing this, why not, and we're doing some stuff where we're kind of looking back and things. I wanted to learn why this album is considered so important, and to see if, I looked at it differently now than how I did back then. And I've been kind of, like I said earlier, I'm hot and cold on Dylan. He's got some stuff that I really like, some other stuff that I just can't listen to. And you mentioned Slow Train Coming, which I think is one of his Christian albums.
Yes, that was his first Christian album.
Right. And it's one of his better albums, even though, he's out.
I love that album.
Yeah. And when Dylan has got his mind straight, he writes great songs. But when he gets up, but he also has a tendency to go off on these weird tangents. And some of my research into this album, I almost portray Dylan as a jerk. You know, he had an incredible career as a folk musician. And I understand if you don't want to do folk any longer. I got no problem with that. Neil Young, you know, Neil Young has dabbled in so many different types of music throughout his career, but he's done it without insulting his audience. You know, and you know, if Neil Young wants to go acoustic, he does acoustic. You know, he hooks up a Crazy Horse and rocks out. He's done 50s doo-wop. You know, he did the weird electronic stuff on trance. You know, so Neil Young does what Neil Young wants to do without insulting anybody. I watched last night a documentary about the early years of Dylan, and it seems like when he decided that he was going to move away from folk music, he developed this attitude of, if you all want to stay and do folk, you're stupid. I'm going off here on some elevated plane. And a lot of the music that he was doing, like Maggie's Farm, was him actually thumbing his nose at the folk people. You know, I ain't going to work on Maggie's Farm no more, meaning I'm not going to do this stuff anymore. And so a lot of, and you're right, I love your thing about what's he so pissed off about. And that's what I see a lot in this album. And for example, Joan Baez helped Dylan's career so much, and they apparently were lovers too. So right before this album comes out, Dylan does a brief tour of England. He takes Joan Baez with him, even though he's married now. So he takes her along, but never once in that entire tour asks Joan Baez to come up on stage and perform with him, even though he's doing a solo acoustic tour. So it's like, what kind of a slap in the face is that to somebody that supported you, that you're intimate with, and you don't even bring her up to have her perform with you after you've shared music together all of those years. So it just seems like he turned into a real jerk, and now I've found this incredible elevated plane that I am, and the rest of you all are just down here still doing this stupid stuff, even though that stupid stuff, you know, made him a hero and a star. So anyway, that's where I'm at now. And like I said, I wanted to get into it because I just wanted to understand why it was so incredibly popular at the time and why so many people hail it as a masterpiece. And I just don't get it. So thank you for supporting me. I don't feel like a troglodyte. But one real quick.
Yeah, I think to understand it, what was the import of this album, I think you have to put it in the context of what was happening in music at the time, and you have to approach it from an academic perspective. Just judging this album on its own merits, like I kind of alluded to before, I think it's impossible. I think it's impossible to do that in 2021 on any kind of an album that comes out in 1965. It's impossible to judge it on its own merits. And I think you do have. I think you have to. I mean, you can tell what your personal reaction is to it, and whether you like it or not, and what you do like it or don't like about it. But I think to understand the importance of it, you have to look beyond that, and you have to look at the context. And one of the things that popped into my mind when you were talking there is that you didn't understand why this was such a landmark album and everything. Well, put it in context in this respect. How many people went into a recording studio in 1965 to record an album and publish an album and release an album to the marketplace, where the piece of art and the statement that was being made was that album? In 1965, 33 1/3 long play pieces of vinyl were essentially collections of hit singles and some filler to get some product out of the market. You know, back in those days, uh, an album as a statement of art wasn't very common. And so in that context, maybe maybe in that context, this was such a landmark, important album because it was a grand statement that back in 1965, in the days when grand musical statements just weren't being made. Grand musical statements in 1965 was when John Lennon actually sang a very personal, realistic song called "Help." You know, but that was one song. That was one song that was a grand artistic statement, and then the rest of that album that appeared on the album "Help" was "Help" and a couple other hit singles, and then a few just kind of throwaway Beatles songs that they wrote and recorded to complete an album. So in that sense, I understand why it was a landmark album, because it was a statement. And albums just weren't statements back in those days. You said, and you surprised me when it said that it was a number 3. It reached number 3 on the Billboard charts. And the only way that would make sense to me is to think that, well, people weren't buying albums back in those days. They were buying singles. So if he had a community of hardcore fans who actually saw this as an artistic statement and this great new thing that Bob Dylan was doing, they went out and bought this album. There probably wasn't a lot of competition on album charts in those days.
I don't know, like a Rolling Stone was released as a single, but they had to do it with half of one side of a 45 and the second half on the other side, and DJs would play the first half, flip the record over, and finish it up. So that's how it became like a hit on AM radio, even despite its length. But yeah, I was surprised when I saw, you know, how well it sold. The other thing is you mentioned, you know, you're not quite into lyrics. I'm real heavy into lyrics. I you know, that has a lot to do with, that's my perspective a lot on songs. And I admire wordplay and like the Doors on LA Woman, when Morrison sings, "I see your hair is burning, hills are filled with fire." Man, I get an image of the wildfires that burn in California. You know, I see your hair is burning, and I just picture, you know, the wildfires burning through the mountains or the hills in California. And that's, you know, paints a picture to me. I look at Dylan off of like, I think this is off Desolation Row. Einstein disguised as Robin Hood with his memories in a trunk, passed this way an hour ago with his friend, the jealous monk. Now he looked so immaculately frightful as he bummed a cigarette, and he went off sniffing drain pipes and reciting the alphabet. What? You know, if it means something, I don't get it. I must be a troglodyte. Sorry, but
yeah, it doesn't mean anything to me, but that doesn't bother me. It means something to him, and
yeah, he was really stoned.
Well, yeah. Yeah, but you know, I mean, comparing it to something that the Doors did 7 years later, there was a lot of evolution between 1965 and 1971 in the world of music. That was one of the most explosive periods in pop music history. You know, things changed so much between 1965 and 1971. But you know, it's tough to compare. But I understand what you're saying. Yeah, it's like the lyrics don't mean that much to me. When I hear something like that, like you just mentioned in the Doors, and that happens, and I get it, and I say, well, yeah, that's pretty good, but that's not. I never I I never turn my reaction on. Uh, uh, my reaction to a piece of music never turns on whether I like the lyric or not, or understand the lyric or not, unless it's something that's just so obvious and in your face. I mean, to me, that 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 to me is secondary to what the music sounds like and what kind of emotional reaction I get from the sounds of the lyrics, not necessarily from what the lyrics actually are.
So you need to go watch the movie Eddie and the Cruisers.
I saw that. I saw it when it first came out. I don't remember a whole lot about it. I just remember it was like whatever happened to Eddie after his car went off into the lake or something.
I mean, it's a throwaway movie, but there's one scene where the character, the teacher who hooks up with the band and starts writing their songs, and they're on the deck or whatever, wherever they're staying, and it's words and music. So
That was Ellen Barkin, wasn't it? Or was she the news reporter?
Ellen Barkin was in there, and
Yeah.
and then oh crap, I can't remember the guy who was portrayed the teacher. Very very well known actor. Crap.
Okay.
Oh well. Anyway, it's kind of a throwaway movie, but it's a fun thing to watch.
It wasn't so much throwaway. I remember it. It was a good rock and roll movie at the time.
Yeah.
Okay, well let's. I think we've pretty much
Beat this one to death.
not beat it to death. It just we both. I think we both surprised each other, and I thought you were going to tell me you like it, and I thought I was going to have an argument with you because I didn't like it, and then you were thinking the same thing.
I really thought that you were going to really be into this thing and explain all the esoteric meanings, and that I'm going to sit here and feel like an idiot next to you.
No, I'm more about talking about how I don't like the sound of his voice, and Al Cooper's Hammond organ is like, in 1965 that was pretty cool, but now it's just cheesy.
Well, actually, Cooper was not a keyboard player. They stuck him on keyboards there, and Cooper later on said, "My playing was terrible because I wasn't a keyboardist." I think Cooper was a guitarist also. And so that's and one of
Cooper was the founder of the original Blood, Sweat, and Tears.
Right, but
that's how I best know him, as the first Blood, Sweat, and Tears album. Anyway, that's not Highway 61 Revisited. That's another conversation.
So do I assume correctly that after this you won't let me pick the topic again?
Oh no! The topic is fine. It's just no.
You had your
good
chance.
Topic. We just surprised each other. That's all.
Yeah, we did. So, gee, all these decades later, I really don't know you.
Well, here's another discussion. I want to go in direction as why in the world did you possibly think that I would be a fan of this album?
Okay.
We'll have that conversation at a different time. Let's go ahead and wrap this one up, and then we might pick up on part 2 later. We're about at the end of the at our limit here. Okay, gang. That was us on Highway 61 Revisited. We surprised each other. Neither one of them are fans of it. Actually, I surprised myself because I like it more than Bob did. That's not to say that I love it. I kind of understand it, but that's as far as my feeling goes on it. Thanks for listening. Join us next week. We'll have another topic next week. In the meantime, check us out at Geezerology.com. Check out Bob on Facebook. Look up Geezerology on Facebook. I think he's still working on putting that together. I haven't talked to him in a couple of days, but maybe we still have hopes for it. I don't know how far we're going. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Take care.